I don't care what your ticket says. Get off my aircraft, now!
Captain Derek Mitchell's voice cut through the first-class cabin like a blade, sharp and final. His silver hair was perfectly styled, his uniform pressed to military precision, and his finger pointed directly at the man in seat 2A. Around them, passengers froze mid-conversation. Phones rose instinctively. The tension was electric. The man in the gray hoodie didn't move. Marcus Williams looked up from his tablet, his dark eyes calm but unwavering. He spoke quietly, but every word carried the weight of absolute certainty. If I leave this plane, Captain, 280 people are going to die. That's not a threat, that's physics. Mitchell's laugh was cruel, mocking the sound of a man who had never been wrong and couldn't imagine starting now. Security was already moving down the aisle, their heavy steps echoing through the cabin like a countdown to disaster. Passengers gasped. Some started recording. Everyone sensed they were witnessing something terrible. What none of them knew was that the man being dragged off Atlantic Airways Flight 447 was the only person who could save them. Before we dive into this incredible story, tell me, where are you watching from? Drop your city in the comments. I want to hear from every corner of the world watching this unfold. If this story of quiet courage and devastating prejudice moves you, hit that subscribe button. What happens next will change how you see justice forever. This isn't just a story about one flight. It's about how assumptions can kill, how competence has no color, and how sometimes the person you least expect holds everyone's life in their hands. Trust me, you've never heard anything like this before, and by the end, you'll never look at an airplane the same way again. Dr. Marcus Williams had been underestimated his entire life. At 36, he was one of the youngest lead systems engineers in aerospace history. Stanford PhD in aerospace engineering, MIT graduate degree in advanced propulsion systems, and the brilliant mind behind the flight control systems for Atlantic Airways' entire Boeing 787 Dreamliner fleet. Every aircraft in their fleet flew because of systems Marcus had designed, tested, and perfected over 6 years of meticulous work. But sitting in seat 2A of Flight 447, wearing his favorite charcoal gray hoodie and dark jeans, Marcus looked nothing like what people expected from a genius. His worn leather backpack was scuffed from years of travel between engineering sites. His sneakers had seen better days. To anyone glancing at him, he looked like a tired graduate student or maybe a tech support worker catching a cheap flight. That was exactly how Marcus preferred it. Growing up in Detroit as the son of an auto worker and a high school teacher, Marcus had learned early that brilliance came in all packages. His parents, David and Catherine Williams, had worked 2 jobs each to send him to MIT. They taught him that respect was earned through competence, not appearance, and that quiet confidence spoke louder than expensive clothes. Marcus carried their lessons with him everywhere. Even now, as passengers whispered and stared, he remained focused on what mattered: the data streaming across his specialized diagnostic tablet. The numbers were telling a story that made his stomach tighten with worry. He was here for one reason: to monitor the critical sensor data on Atlantic Airways' newest wing stabilizer system. It was his design, his innovation, and his responsibility. The early readings from previous flights had shown minor fluctuations, barely noticeable to anyone else, but to Marcus, they were warning signs of something much worse. What he was seeing now confirmed his worst fears. Storm clouds gathered over New York like a bruised fist, and the first drops of rain were already streaking down the massive glass windows of JFK Terminal 4. The weather forecast called for severe turbulence, delayed departures, and frustrated travelers. It was exactly the kind of day when tempers ran short and patience wore thin. Atlantic Airways Flight 447 sat at Gate 23 gleaming under the terminal lights. The Boeing 787 Dreamliner was the crown jewel of the airline's fleet, representing everything modern aviation could achieve. Advanced carbon fiber construction made it lighter than steel but stronger than aluminum. Cutting-edge avionics promised smoother flights and better fuel efficiency. The marketing materials called it the future of flying. Marcus knew better. He knew every bolt, every every wire, every line of code that made this aircraft possible. He also knew that the future of flying was only as reliable as the humans who operated it. The VIP departure lounge buzzed with quiet conversations and the soft clink of crystal glasses. Marble floors reflected the warm lighting, creating an atmosphere of luxury and exclusivity. Business executives checked their phones. Wealthy families gathered around children with expensive gadgets, and everyone seemed to exist in their own bubble of privilege. This was first class. This was where Marcus belonged, at least according to his ticket. But, as he would soon discover, belonging and being welcomed were two very different things. Flight details scrolled across departure monitors: JFK to London Heathrow, departure 6:15 p.m., flight time 6 hours 45 minutes, aircraft Boeing 787, 9 full capacity, 280 passengers. The plane was completely booked from first class to economy, every seat filled with someone trusting Atlantic Airways to carry them safely across the Atlantic Ocean. Outside, the storm was getting worse. Captain Derek Mitchell stood in the cockpit reviewing flight plans with the arrogance of a man who had never met a challenge he couldn't master. At 52, he was a 25-year veteran of commercial aviation with over 15,000 flight hours, and a reputation for getting passengers to their destinations on time regardless of weather or obstacles. His silver hair and square jaw made him look like he'd stepped out of a recruiting poster for airline pilots. But Mitchell had a problem with the modern world. He hated automation, despised the computers that now flew most of the plane, and especially resented engineers who thought their designs were more important than pilot experience. To Mitchell, flying was an art, not a science, and no amount of data could replace good old-fashioned stick-and-rudder skills. He was about to learn exactly how wrong he was. Sofia Rodriguez moved through the first-class cabin with practiced efficiency her 29 years, giving her just enough experience to think she understood people at first glance. As senior flight attendant, she prided herself on maintaining the exclusive atmosphere that first-class passengers expected. She knew immediately who belonged and who didn't, and she wasn't afraid to act on those instincts. Sophia had worked her way up from economy service over 5 years, and she guarded her position fiercely. First class meant dealing with celebrities, executives, politicians, important people who dressed the part and acted like they owned the world. Someone like the man in seat 2A didn't fit her careful understanding of how things worked. Patricia Blackwell swept through the airport like royalty, her designer heels clicking authoritatively on marble floors. At 58, she was the wife of a pharmaceutical CEO and had never met a privilege she didn't think she'd earned. Her Louis Vuitton luggage Hermes handbag and custom-tailored traveling outfit announced her status to anyone within sight. Patricia flew first class exclusively and expected the airline to maintain certain standards. Those standards in her mind included keeping out people who might make her uncomfortable. She had strong opinions about who belonged in her section of the plane, and she wasn't shy about sharing them. Tyler Brooks worked the gate podium with the enthusiasm of someone counting minutes until his shift ended. At 24, he was fresh out of college and treating his Atlantic Airways job as a stepping stone to something better. He'd learned to make quick judgments about passengers who would cause trouble, who deserved extra attention, who could be dismissed without consequences. Tyler's training had taught him to be polite to everyone, but his instincts told him that some passengers were more important than others. He was about to learn exactly how dangerous those instincts could be. Robert Hayes had built his business career on paying attention to details others missed. The 45-year-old executive was flying to London for merger negotiations, and his sharp eyes constantly evaluated situations for opportunities and threats. Unlike many business travelers, Robert still believed in basic fairness and wasn't afraid to speak up when he saw something wrong. He was also never without his phone, always ready to document moments that others might want to forget. Finally, there was Jonathan Harrison, the 55-year-old CEO of Atlantic Airways, currently in his Manhattan office reviewing quarterly reports. Harrison had built the airline from a regional carrier into an international success story, but he'd done it by focusing on numbers rather than people. He was about to discover that his company's culture had developed problems that no spreadsheet could measure. Within hours, all of these people would be connected by a crisis that would test everything they believed about competence, prejudice, and the price of assumptions. Marcus Williams stood quietly in the priority boarding lane, checking his tablet one more time before boarding. The data was getting worse. The left stabilizer's hydraulic pressure readings were fluctuating in a pattern that made his engineering instincts scream warnings. He needed to get on this plane not for the first-class seat his company had booked, but to monitor the sensors during flight. "Excuse me." The voice was sharp, cutting through his concentration like a knife. "Economy boarding is that way." Marcus looked up to see Patricia Blackwell pointing toward the general boarding area, her expression mixing annoyance with disbelief. She clutched her Hermes bag like a shield and stared at him as if he'd wandered into her living room uninvited. "I'm in the right line," Marcus said calmly, holding up his boarding pass. "Seat 2A. Patricia's eyes widened, then narrowed. She turned to her husband, speaking loudly enough for everyone around them to hear. "Richard, look at this. They're letting anyone use the priority lane now." "I suppose standards don't mean what they used to." Her words rippled through the boarding area like a stone thrown into still water. Other first-class passengers turned to stare. Some looked embarrassed by Patricia's bluntness, but others nodded in agreement. A few pulled out their phones either to complain to the airline or to start recording what they sensed might become an incident. Marcus had been here before. Not literally in this airport, but in this moment, the moment when strangers decided he didn't belong based on nothing more than his appearance. He'd learned long ago that responding with anger only confirmed their assumptions. Better to let his credentials speak for themselves. "Ma'am," Marcus said quietly, "I understand your concern about airline policies, but I've been flying Atlantic Airways for 6 years and I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be," Patricia scoffed. "Flying first class, because there's a difference between having a ticket and being able to afford one." The whispers were growing louder now. Other passengers were choosing sides without knowing any facts. Some were clearly uncomfortable with Patricia's accusations, but others seemed to agree that Marcus looked out of place among the business suits and designer clothes. "He doesn't even have proper luggage," someone murmured behind Marcus. "Probably upgraded with points or something," another voice added. Marcus felt a familiar weight of being judged, measured, and found wanting by people who knew nothing about him. His worn leather backpack suddenly felt heavier, his comfortable clothes marking him as an outsider in a world of status symbols. But the data on his tablet was getting worse, and he couldn't afford to let pride interfere with safety. Whatever these people thought about him, 280 lives might depend on his being on this flight. Robert Hayes watched the scene unfold from the 3 passengers back in line, his business instincts telling him this was about to become a much bigger problem. He'd seen workplace discrimination before, but rarely so openly displayed. His phone was already in his hand, finger hovering over the record button. "This is about to get ugly," he whispered to the woman next to him, who was also staring at the confrontation. Patricia's voice grew louder, emboldened by what she mistook for support from other passengers. "I pay good money for first-class service, and that includes not having to wonder if the person next to me belongs there. Maybe you should check his ticket more carefully." Marcus felt something shift in his chest, not anger, but a deep sadness for people so trapped by their assumptions they couldn't see past them. He thought about his parents who had worked multiple jobs to give him opportunities these people took for granted. He thought about the 6 years he'd spent designing the aircraft they would all soon board. Most of all, he thought about the data showing potential hydraulic failure, and decided that dignity mattered less than duty. Tyler Brooks looked up from his computer screen as the priority boarding line reached his podium, immediately noticing the disturbance near the front. He could hear raised voices and see phones being held up to record whatever was happening. Great. Another social media incident waiting to happen. When Marcus finally reached the boarding gate, Tyler barely glanced at him before holding out his hand for the boarding pass. This was the moment Tyler had been dreading. Whatever drama was brewing in line was now his responsibility to handle. Marcus scanned his phone against the reader. The machine beeped with a solid affirmative green light. First class, Seat 2A, VIP status, corporate account. Tyler blinked, looking at his screen more carefully. Dr. Marcus Williams, Aerotech Dynamics, priority corporate passenger. But looking at Marcus, really looking at him, Tyler saw only a young black man in casual clothes who didn't match Tyler's mental image of a corporate VIP. The dissonance made him uncomfortable, and like many people facing unexpected situations, he chose the explanation that fit his assumptions rather than the evidence in front of him. Dr. Freeman Tyler said, deliberately mispronouncing the name while studying Marcus's appearance. Corporate VIP status. Williams Marcus corrected gently. And yes, Aerotech Dynamics has a standing agreement with Atlantic Airways for engineering consultations. Tyler typed something into his computer, frowning at the screen as if it were giving him incorrect information. I don't see any memo about corporate personnel flying today. Usually, we get advance notice for special passengers. The word special hung in the air with obvious implications. Behind Marcus, other passengers were growing impatient but also increasingly interested in the delay. It was a last-minute addition. Marcus explained, his patience beginning to wear thin. I need to monitor stress sensors on the new wing stabilizer systems during this transatlantic crossing. It's routine maintenance monitoring. Tyler shrugged a gesture that managed to convey both dismissal and skepticism. Well, the computer says your ticket is valid, so I guess you can board. But maybe next time dress appropriately for the cabin you're sitting in. First-class passengers pay a lot of money for their experience. They don't expect to feel like they're sitting in a gym locker room. The insult hit its mark, but Marcus kept his expression neutral. He'd heard worse, and from people who mattered more than a gate agent having a bad day. But behind him, other passengers were listening, and some were already forming opinions about whether Tyler was speaking for them. Robert Hayes had heard enough. He stepped forward, his phone now openly recording. "Excuse me," Robert said, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being heard. "Did you just tell a paying first-class passenger to dress differently? Is that Atlantic Airways policy?" Now Tyler's face flushed red. "Sir, you were just explaining dress codes that don't exist, commenting on someone's appearance based on what exactly?" Robert kept his phone steady, making sure he captured Tyler's discomfort. Patricia Blackwell, who had been watching the entire exchange, chose this moment to insert herself into the conversation. "Well, there are certain expectations for premium service. We're not being unreasonable to want our cabin to maintain appropriate standards." Appropriate according to whom, Robert asked, turning his camera toward Patricia. "And what exactly makes someone inappropriate for first class? The color of their skin. Their choice of comfortable travel clothes." The boarding area had gone quiet except for the sound of phones recording and fingers typing on social media. What had started as one woman's complaint was becoming a viral moment, with passengers choosing sides and the airline's reputation hanging in the balance. Marcus watched it all unfold with a mixture of appreciation for Robert's support and growing concern about the time they were wasting. The data on his tablet was showing increasing instability in the hydraulic systems, and every minute of delay made the situation more dangerous. "I appreciate everyone's concern," Marcus said, his voice cutting through the arguments. "But we're holding up the flight, and weather delays are already pushing our departure time. I'd like to board now, if that's acceptable." Tyler, now fully aware that he was being recorded by multiple passengers, made a decision he would regret for the rest of his career. Instead of de-escalating the situation, he doubled down on his authority. "Sir, I need you to wait here while I call my supervisor. There seem to be questions about your status, and I want to make sure everything is properly verified before boarding begins." It was the wrong decision at the wrong time, and everyone watching knew it. Robert Hayes had seen enough corporate discrimination to recognize it when it happened, but rarely had he witnessed it so blatantly displayed in public. His business travel had taken him through dozens of airports, and he'd never seen a first-class passenger subjected to this kind of scrutiny based purely on appearance. His Instagram story was already going live, watching discrimination in real time at JFK. Atlantic Airways gate agent questioning black passengers' right to sit in first class. This is 2024 people. Within minutes, the hashtag #Atlantic Airways discrimination was beginning to trend on social media. Robert's followers were sharing the story, adding their own commentary and tagging news outlets that specialized in viral discrimination stories. "This is insane," typed one follower. "Hope this guy sues them for everything they've got. Why is this still happening?" wrote another. "When will airlines learn?" But the social media response was just beginning. Other passengers in the boarding area were capturing different angles of the confrontation, some supporting Marcus, others seeming to agree with Patricia's concerns about standards. A young woman named Ashley Martinez posted to TikTok, "Rich white woman tries to kick black man out of first-class boarding line. The entitlement is real." Her video, shot from across the boarding area, captured Patricia's aggressive gestures and Tyler's uncomfortable responses. Meanwhile, Patricia herself seemed oblivious to the growing digital storm. She was busy texting her husband, who had moved away from the confrontation to distance himself from his wife's increasingly public statements. "This is exactly what's wrong with airlines today," Patricia said loudly, apparently addressing anyone within earshot. "They've completely abandoned their standards. First class used to mean something. Now, apparently, anyone with a credit card thinks they can sit wherever they want." An older gentleman in a business suit nodded in agreement. "I've been flying first class for 30 years, and the decline in passenger quality is obvious. Airlines need to do a better job screening who they let in premium cabins." But they were outnumbered by passengers who found the entire spectacle embarrassing and wrong. A family with teenage children looked appalled by Patricia's comments. A young couple was whispering angrily about calling the NAACP. Several business travelers were shaking their heads in obvious disgust. Most importantly, people were recording everything. The age of smartphones meant that discrimination couldn't hide in shadows anymore. Every biased comment, every unfair action, every moment of prejudice was being captured and shared with audiences that measured in millions rather than dozens. Marcus remained calm through it all, occasionally glancing at his tablet where the hydraulic pressure readings continued to deteriorate. He was watching two disasters unfold simultaneously: the social crisis around him and the potential mechanical crisis that only he could see. The irony wasn't lost on him. The same people questioning his right to be on the aircraft were depending on systems he had designed to keep them safe. If they only knew how much their lives depended on the man they were trying to exclude, they might think twice about their assumptions. Tyler was becoming increasingly aware that his handling of the situation was being broadcast to the world, but he'd already committed to his course of action. Pride and policy prevented him from backing down, even as the evidence mounted that he was making a career-ending mistake. His supervisor, Janet Morrison, was dealing with other delayed flights and wouldn't return his call for another 10 minutes. By then, the story would have spread far beyond the airport, and Atlantic Airways would be facing a public relations crisis that would overshadow everything else about Flight 447. Everything except what Marcus was seeing on his tablet: a hydraulic system that was slowly but steadily moving toward catastrophic failure at 35,000 feet. When Tyler's supervisor finally arrived and grudgingly allowed Marcus to board, the atmosphere in the first-class cabin was already electric with tension. Word of the gate confrontation had traveled through the passenger manifest faster than gossip at a high school reunion. Everyone boarding after Marcus knew exactly who he was and had formed opinions about whether he belonged there. Marcus found seat 2A and immediately began stowing his essential equipment. His diagnostic tablet was the most important item in his bag, a ruggedized device specifically designed to interface with Boeing 787 maintenance systems. Most passengers would see it as an expensive computer. Marcus saw it as a lifeline that might save everyone on the plane. The tablet connected wirelessly to the aircraft's maintenance network through protocols that Marcus himself had helped design. Within seconds, real-time data began streaming across his screen engine temperatures, hydraulic pressures, electrical system status, wing stress measurements, and dozens of other parameters that told the story of the aircraft's health. What he saw made his stomach tighten with worry. The left stabilizer's hydraulic pressure was now showing a 1.2% variance from optimal levels. To most people, that would sound like a trivial deviation, barely worth noticing. But Marcus knew that hydraulic systems were like human circulatory systems. Small problems became big problems very quickly, especially under the stress of high-altitude flight. At ground level, the aircraft's backup systems could compensate for minor hydraulic variations. But at 35,000 feet with the plane flying at 550 miles per hour through turbulent air, that 1.2% variance could become a 5% failure in minutes. And a 5% failure in the stabilizer hydraulics would mean complete loss of control authority. Marcus opened his engineering notes and began calculating failure probability curves, his fingers moving quickly across the tablet's screen. The math was unforgiving. If the current rate of deterioration continued, the hydraulic system would reach a critical failure approximately 90 minutes into the flight. That would put them somewhere over the North Atlantic, hundreds of miles from the nearest emergency landing site. But even more troubling was the pattern of the pressure variations. This wasn't random mechanical wear, it was a progressive failure that suggested a fundamental flaw in either the system design or the installation. Marcus had reviewed the installation protocols personally, and they had been followed correctly, which meant the problem was in his design. The possibility that his own engineering work might be flawed was devastating, but not as devastating as the possibility of 280 people dying because he'd missed something critical in his calculations. Whatever was causing the hydraulic instability, Marcus was probably the only person on the plane qualified to diagnose and potentially fix it. He was so absorbed in the data that he didn't notice Patricia Blackwell settling into seat 1A or her pointed comments to her husband about the situation in the seat behind them. He missed the flight attendants gathering near the galley, whispering among themselves about the passenger who had caused trouble during boarding. Marcus was focused entirely on the numbers, and the numbers were telling him that Flight 447 was flying toward disaster. Sofia Rodriguez had been briefed about the incident at the gate before boarding began. According to Tyler's report, there had been questions about a passenger's credentials and some kind of social media controversy involving discrimination accusations. Tyler had been vague about details, but the implication was clear someone had complained about a passenger who didn't fit first-class expectations. When Sophia saw Marcus in seat 2A, absorbed in his tablet and dressed in casual clothes that cost less than most first-class passengers' shoes, she immediately knew she was looking at the source of the problem. Her 5 years of flight attendant experience had taught her to read passenger dynamics quickly, and everything about this situation set off warning bells. First, there was Patricia Blackwell's obvious displeasure. Patricia was a frequent flyer who commanded respect and generated significant revenue for Atlantic Airways. Her complaints carried weight, and Sophia knew that keeping VIP passengers happy was essential to her own career advancement. Second, there was the matter of the tablet. Sophia had attended mandatory training about electronic devices and cybersecurity threats. Passengers weren't supposed to connect personal devices to aircraft systems, and Marcus's tablet was obviously interfacing with something on the plane. The screen showed scrolling data and technical readouts that looked exactly like what security training had warned them about. Third, there was Marcus himself. Sophia prided herself on reading people, and Marcus didn't read like a typical first-class passenger. He was too young, too casually dressed, and too focused on his technology to match her profile of corporate executives and wealthy travelers. In her experience, people who belonged in first class acted like they belonged. Marcus acted like someone trying to prove he had the right to be there. Sophia made a decision that would soon prove catastrophic for her career and potentially for everyone on the plane. Instead of asking polite questions or giving Marcus the benefit of the doubt, she decided to challenge his presence directly. "Excuse me, sir," Sophia said, approaching Marcus's seat with the authoritative tone she used for unruly passengers. "I need to see your boarding pass again." Marcus looked up from his tablet, blinking as he refocused from technical data to human interaction. "I showed it at the gate. There was quite a discussion about it, actually." "Yes, well, there seems to be a discrepancy with our manifest. Sophia lied smoothly, and I need you to turn that electronic device off immediately. We're still at the gate, and personal devices aren't allowed to connect to aircraft systems." Marcus's expression shifted from confusion to concern. "This isn't a personal device. It's a certified diagnostic tool with FAA approval for maintenance monitoring. I have authorization from Aerotech Dynamics to—" "I don't care what authorizations you claim to have," Sophia interrupted, her voice rising enough to catch the attention of nearby passengers. "You're tampering with airline property, and that's a federal offense. Unplug that device immediately." The accusation hung in the air like an electrical charge. Other first-class passengers turned to stare, some pulling out phones to record what was obviously becoming another confrontation. Patricia Blackwell smiled with satisfied vindication. She'd been right about this passenger all along. Marcus felt the familiar frustration of being disbelieved by people who should know better. But this time the stakes were higher than his pride or even his professional reputation. The data on his tablet was showing continued deterioration in the hydraulic systems, and turning off his monitoring equipment would leave him blind to potentially catastrophic changes. "Ma'am," Marcus said, his voice remaining calm despite his growing alarm. "I'm Dr. Marcus Williams, lead systems engineer for Aerotech Dynamics. We designed the flight control systems for this aircraft. This tablet is monitoring critical safety parameters, and shutting it down would be extremely inadvisable." Sophia stared at him for a moment, then let out a short, incredulous laugh that carried clearly through the cabin. "You designed the plane right, and I'm the Secretary of Transportation, sir. I've been doing this job for 5 years, and I know a security threat when I see one." She stepped closer, lowering her voice but not her intensity. "You can either comply voluntarily, or I can call security and have you removed from the aircraft. Given the trouble you've already caused today, I don't think that would end well for you." Marcus looked around the cabin, seeing the mixture of curiosity, judgment, and entertainment on fellow passengers' faces. Some looked sympathetic, others seemed to agree with Sophia's suspicions, and a few were obviously recording the confrontation for social media. But what worried him most was the data on his tablet, which was now showing hydraulic pressure variations approaching 1.5% deviation. The system was failing faster than his worst-case projections, and they hadn't even taken off yet. Robert Hayes had followed the drama from boarding through settling into his seat in row 3B, and he'd been documenting everything on his social media accounts. His Instagram story now had multiple segments covering the gate confrontation, the boarding controversy, and now Sophia's aggressive confrontation with Marcus. Part 3 of Hash. Atlantic Airways, Discrimination. Robert narrated quietly to his phone camera. Flight attendant now claiming the passenger is tampering with aircraft systems because he has a laptop. This is getting insane. His Instagram story was being shared faster than he could track the notifications. The hashtag #Atlantic Airways Discrimination was now trending on multiple platforms, with hundreds of people sharing their own experiences of airline discrimination and demanding accountability from Atlantic Airways. But Robert wasn't the only passenger documenting the confrontation. Ashley Martinez, the TikTok creator from the gate area, had boarded with her phone already recording. Her latest video showed Sophia's confrontation with Marcus, including her dismissive laugh when he explained his credentials. "Y'all, this flight attendant really just laughed at a black engineer and called him a security threat for having a work computer." Ashley's caption read, "This is what racism looks like in 2024. Share this everywhere." The video was going viral in real time, with comments flooding in faster than the airplane Wi-Fi could handle. "This is disgusting. I'm never flying Atlantic Airways again. That man is more qualified to be on that plane than anyone else there." Where's the CEO? This airline needs to answer for this immediately. I hope he sues them for everything they've got. Meanwhile, Patricia Blackwell was contributing to the digital conversation in her own way, texting furiously with friends and family about the security situation unfolding around her. You wouldn't believe what's happening on my flight, she texted to her country club group chat. Some man with a computer claiming he's an engineer. Flight attendant thinks he might be a terrorist or something. I knew something was wrong the moment I saw him in the priority line. Her messages, shared among her wealthy social circle, created a different narrative, one that painted Marcus as a potential threat rather than a victim of discrimination. But Patricia's influence was limited to her own privileged bubble, while the viral videos were reaching millions of people who recognized injustice when they saw it. News outlets were beginning to pick up the story. Aviation reporters, civil rights organizations, and social media influencers were all sharing versions of the confrontation, each adding their own commentary and analysis. Breaking passenger claims discrimination on Atlantic Airways flight, tweeted Aviation Daily, a trade publication with 100,000 followers. Another day, another airline discrimination scandal posted the NAACP's official account sharing Robert's Instagram story. This is exactly why we need federal legislation protecting passengers from airline bias, commented a civil rights lawyer who specialized in transportation discrimination cases. The story was taking on a life of its own, spreading far beyond the aircraft and creating pressure that would soon reach Atlantic Airways' executive offices. But none of the social media attention was addressing the real crisis, the hydraulic system that Marcus was desperately trying to monitor while being accused of terrorism for doing his job. As the confrontation escalated, Marcus made a decision that would soon prove prescient. He discreetly activated the emergency data logging function on his tablet, ensuring that whatever happened next, there would be a complete technical record of the aircraft's condition leading up to any potential crisis. He had no idea how soon that record would become the difference between life and death for everyone on Flight 447. The cockpit door burst open with a sound like authority itself. Captain Derek Mitchell strode into the first-class cabin. His silver hair perfectly styled his uniform immaculate, and his jaw set in the expression of a man accustomed to solving problems with decisive action. Behind him, Sofia Rodriguez followed like a deputy eager to see justice served. Mitchell had been flying commercial aircraft for 25 years, accumulating over 15,000 flight hours and a reputation as one of Atlantic Airways' most reliable captains. He'd successfully handled emergency landings, severe weather, and unruly passengers with equal competence. In his mind, this was just another situation requiring firm leadership and clear authority. What Mitchell didn't know was that he was about to make the worst decision of his career. "Where's the problem, passenger?" Mitchell asked loudly, his voice carrying clearly through the cabin. His eyes swept the first-class section until they landed on Marcus, who was still absorbed in the increasingly alarming data on his tablet. Sophia pointed dramatically. "Seat 2A, Captain. He's been connecting unauthorized devices to aircraft systems and claims to be some kind of engineer. When I asked him to comply with safety protocols, he became argumentative and disruptive." Mitchell looked at Marcus, really looked at him, and saw exactly what Sophia had seen: a young black man in casual clothes who didn't fit the profile of passengers he was accustomed to defending. The dissonance between Marcus's appearance and his claimed credentials triggered every bias Mitchell didn't realize he carried. Sir Mitchell set his voice, carrying the full weight of his authority. "I'm Captain Mitchell, and this is my aircraft. I understand you've been causing problems since boarding began." Marcus looked up from his tablet, his expression shifting from concentration to concern. "Captain, there are no problems with me, but there are serious problems with your hydraulic systems that we need to discuss immediately." Mitchell's eyes flicked to the tablet, seeing the scrolling data and technical readouts that Sophia had reported. His security training kicked in, overriding any inclination to listen to Marcus's actual words. "I need you to shut down that device immediately and explain why you're attempting to access restricted aircraft systems," Mitchell said, stepping closer to Marcus's seat. "Unauthorized access to flight control computers is a federal crime. Captain Marcus said, his patience beginning to fray. "I'm Dr. Marcus Williams from Aerotech Dynamics. We designed the flight control systems for this aircraft. This tablet is monitoring critical safety parameters that indicate potential hydraulic failure in your left stabilizer system." Mitchell's laugh was sharp and dismissive. "Right. And I suppose you just happened to be on my flight wearing a hoodie and carrying hacking equipment." "Sir, I've been flying for 25 years. I think I can tell the difference between a passenger and a systems engineer." The cabin had gone completely silent except for the quiet hum of phones recording every word. Other passengers watched with fascination and growing alarm as the confrontation escalated beyond anything they'd expected from a routine flight. Marcus felt the familiar frustration of being prejudged, but now that frustration was mixing with genuine alarm about the aircraft's condition. The hydraulic pressure variance had reached 1.8%, approaching the threshold where backup systems would begin engaging automatically. "Captain, with the respect, your hydraulic systems are failing. I need to monitor these readings during flight to ensure passenger safety. This isn't about credentials or authority. This is about physics and engineering reality." Mitchell's face darkened with anger. "Don't lecture me about flying, son. I've landed planes in conditions you couldn't imagine. I don't need some kid with a computer telling me how to do my job." Marcus realized that appealing to authority wasn't working, so he tried appealing to evidence. He turned his tablet toward Mitchell, showing the real-time hydraulic pressure readings that painted an increasingly alarming picture of system deterioration. "Captain, look at this data. Left stabilizer hydraulic pressure has varied by 1.8% over the past 20 minutes. This isn't normal fluctuation, it's progressive failure. If this continues, you'll lose control authority at altitude." Mitchell glanced at the screen dismissively. "I see numbers on a computer screen. Anyone can generate numbers. What I don't see is any official notification from maintenance, any warnings from aircraft systems, or any reason to believe unauthorized passenger equipment over certified flight instruments. Your certified flight instruments won't detect this failure pattern until it's too late," Marcus explained urgently. "The monitoring systems I designed are more sensitive than standard aircraft sensors. They can detect microfluctuations that indicate impending catastrophic failure." "You designed," Mitchell's voice dripped with skepticism. "Kid, I don't know what game you're playing, but I'm not interested in participating. Atlantic Airways has been flying 787S for 3 years without incident. Our maintenance records are impeccable, our safety protocols are industry standard, and our aircraft systems are monitored by the most advanced technology available." Marcus pulled up a screen showing technical specifications that only someone intimately familiar with Boeing 787 systems could understand. "Captain, I can show you the design schematics, the installation protocols, the testing data. Everything that proves these systems are my work. But what matters right now is that your left stabilizer hydraulic system is approaching critical failure." Mitchell barely glanced at the technical data. His aviation experience had taught him that complex emergencies were usually preceded by multiple warning systems, and none of his cockpit instruments were showing any irregularities. More importantly, his experience with unruly passengers had taught him that people would claim anything to avoid consequences for disruptive behavior. "I've heard enough," Mitchell said, his voice rising to fill the cabin. "Sir, you've disrupted boarding, violated federal regulations regarding electronic devices, and attempted to access restricted aircraft systems without authorization. I'm ordering you to shut down that device and disembark immediately." "Captain, you don't understand." "No, you don't understand," Mitchell interrupted angrily. "I'm responsible for the safety of 280 passengers and crew. I don't have time for game scams or whatever this is. Security is already on their way, and you can explain your engineering credentials to federal agents on the ground." Marcus felt desperation beginning to override his professional composure. The hydraulic readings were now showing 2.1% variance, and the pattern suggested accelerating failure. At this rate, the system would reach critical instability within the first hour of flight, well before they could return to an airport for emergency landing. Captain Mitchell Marcus said, standing to face the pilot directly, I'm begging you to listen. My name is Dr. Marcus Williams. I have a PhD in aerospace engineering from Stanford. I've spent 6 years working on the flight control systems for Atlantic Airways' 787 fleet. The aircraft you're about to fly has a hydraulic system that's failing in a pattern I recognize because I helped design the monitoring protocols that are detecting it. Mitchell stared at Marcus for a long moment, taking in his casual clothes, his youth, his earnest expression, and his desperate tone. Everything about the situation felt like a scam designed to manipulate him into poor decisions. I don't care if you claim to have designed the space shuttle, Mitchell said finally. You look like a troublemaker, not an engineer, and I'm not risking the safety of this flight based on whatever story you're trying to sell. Security officers were already boarding the aircraft called by Sofia Rodriguez before Mitchell had even entered the cabin. They moved efficiently through the first-class section, guided by Sofia's pointing finger toward Seat 2A. This is the passenger causing the disturbance, Sofia told the lead security officer, a large man named Frank Gutierrez, who had dealt with unruly passengers before. He's been attempting to access aircraft computer systems without authorization, and the captain has ordered his removal. Frank looked at Marcus, seeing a calm young man holding a tablet and looking more concerned than defiant. In Frank's experience, truly disruptive passengers were usually agitated, argumentative, or obviously intoxicated. Marcus appeared to be none of those things. Sir Frank said professionally, I need you to gather your belongings and come with us. The captain has requested your removal from the aircraft. Marcus looked around the cabin, seeing dozens of passengers recording the confrontation, their expressions ranging from sympathy to entertainment to judgment. Patricia Blackwell was smiling with obvious satisfaction. Robert Hayes looked angry and was speaking rapidly into his phone. Other passengers seemed confused about what was happening and why. Officer Marcus said quietly, May I ask what I'm being removed for? I haven't broken any laws, violated any regulations, or threatened anyone's safety. In fact, I'm trying to prevent a safety emergency that could kill everyone on this plane. Frank glanced at Captain Mitchell, who nodded grimly. Sir, you're being removed for attempting to access restricted computer systems and for disruptive behavior during boarding. The captain has absolute authority over aircraft safety, and he's determined that your presence poses a risk to this flight. The only risk to this flight is ignoring the hydraulic system failure that I'm trying to monitor, Marcus replied, his voice remaining calm despite his growing desperation. But I understand that you have procedures to follow. Marcus began gathering his belongings, moving slowly and deliberately to avoid any actions that might be interpreted as threatening. His tablet continued displaying hydraulic data that showed the system deteriorating toward critical failure, but no one else in the cabin understood what the numbers meant. As he stood to leave, Marcus made one final attempt to prevent the disaster he could see approaching. He turned to face the entire first-class cabin, speaking clearly enough for everyone to hear. Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Dr. Marcus Williams, and I'm a systems engineer with Aerotech Dynamics. This aircraft has a hydraulic failure developing in the left stabilizer system. If you experience any unusual vibrations, rolling motions, or control problems during flight, please alert the flight crew immediately and request an emergency landing at the nearest airport. Enough, Mitchell barked. Remove him now. Security escorted Marcus down the aisle, past passengers who were recording every moment on their phones. As he reached the aircraft door, Marcus stopped and turned back toward Captain Mitchell. Captain, he said, his voice carrying clearly through the cabin, when that hydraulic system fails, and it will fail, remember that you had someone on this plane who could have helped you prevent it. Remember that you chose to remove the one person who understood the systems keeping you alive. Mitchell's face flushed with anger. Get him out of here before I have him arrested for making terroristic threats. That wasn't a threat, Captain Marcus said sadly. It was a warning. And I hope for everyone's sake that I'm wrong about what's going to happen. But Marcus knew he wasn't wrong. The data was unforgiving, the physics were immutable, and 280 people were about to fly into mortal danger because prejudice had triumphed over expertise. As security escorted him off the aircraft, Marcus activated the emergency beacon function on his tablet, ensuring that Aerotech's monitoring station would receive real-time data about Flight 447's condition throughout the flight. It wasn't much, but it was the only way he could continue trying to protect the passengers who had just rejected his help. Behind him, passengers were posting videos and social media updates about the dramatic removal of a passenger who claimed to be an engineer. Most focused on the discrimination and injustice they'd witnessed. None of them realized they'd just watched the removal of the only person who might be able to save their lives. Flight 447 finally pushed back from the gate at 6:47 p.m., 32 minutes behind schedule due to what the gate agents diplomatically called a security incident. Captain Mitchell completed his pre-flight checklist with the confident efficiency of someone who had performed these routines thousands of times. Every system showed green. Every reading fell within normal parameters. Everything appeared perfect for a routine transatlantic crossing. In the passenger cabin, the mood was a mixture of relief at finally departing and excited chatter about the dramatic confrontation they'd all witnessed. Phones buzzed constantly with social media notifications as passengers shared videos, commented on posts, and debated whether the removed passenger had been treated fairly or properly identified as a security threat. Patricia Blackwell was holding court in first class, explaining to anyone who would listen how she'd recognized something was wrong with Marcus from the moment she saw him in the priority boarding line. "You develop instincts about people," she said, with the confidence of someone whose suspicions had been validated by authority figures. Sofia Rodriguez moved through the cabin with professional satisfaction, accepting quiet congratulations from passengers who appreciated her decisive action in protecting their safety. In her mind, she'd successfully identified and neutralized a potential threat exactly as her training had taught her. Meanwhile, 400 yards away in Terminal 4, Marcus Williams sat in the Atlantic Airways operations office, surrounded by skeptical airline officials and airport security personnel. He'd been detained for questioning about his alleged attempt to access aircraft computer systems, and his claims about being a systems engineer were being treated as elaborate lies designed to cover criminal activity. Dr. Williams said, "Janet Morrison, Atlantic Airways shift supervisor, we've contacted Aerotech Dynamics, and while they confirm you're an employee, they have no record of you being authorized for maintenance monitoring on Flight 447. They're actually quite concerned about your unauthorized use of proprietary diagnostic equipment." Marcus felt sick. Aerotech's corporate security protocols required advance approval for any on-site monitoring, and his last-minute decision to board the flight meant he'd bypassed normal authorization procedures. To anyone investigating the situation, he looked exactly like a rogue employee attempting unauthorized access to aircraft systems. But what made Marcus feel sicker was the real-time data streaming to his tablet from Flight 447's sensors. The hydraulic pressure variance in the left stabilizer system had reached 2.3% and was continuing to climb. The aircraft was now climbing through 15,000 feet, and every 1,000 feet of altitude increased the stress on failing hydraulic components. Miss Morrison, Marcus said urgently, "I understand your concerns about authorization, but Flight 447 is flying into mechanical failure. The hydraulic system readings I'm receiving show progressive deterioration that will become catastrophic within the next hour. You need to contact Captain Mitchell and order an immediate return to JFK." Janet looked at the tablet screen, seeing scrolling numbers and technical displays that meant nothing to her. She'd been dealing with airline operations for 12 years, and she'd learned to be suspicious of anyone claiming to have critical information that contradicted normal procedures. "Mr. Williams, even if your readings are accurate, Captain Mitchell has full authority over flight safety decisions. If there were serious mechanical problems, his aircraft systems would alert him automatically. Our 787s have multiple redundant safety systems specifically designed to prevent the kind of failure you're describing." Marcus tried a different approach. "Miss Morrison, can you at least relay my concerns to the cockpit? Ask Captain Mitchell to monitor his hydraulic pressure readings more closely than usual." Ask him to be alert for any unusual vibrations or control responses. I'm not asking you to order an emergency landing. I'm just asking you to make sure the flight crew is prepared for potential problems." Janet considered this request. It seemed reasonable, and it would create documentation that Atlantic Airways had responded appropriately to Marcus's concerns, even if those concerns proved unfounded. "I can do that," she said, reaching for the radio to contact Flight 447. But Captain Mitchell was busy managing the complex air traffic environment around JFK and didn't want to be bothered with ground-based concerns about a passenger who'd already been identified as disruptive and potentially delusional. 43 minutes into Flight 447's journey, First Officer Jennifer Stevens noticed a subtle vibration through the control yoke that wasn't consistent with normal turbulence patterns. She'd been flying 787S for 3 years, and she'd developed sensitivity to the aircraft's normal rhythms and responses. Captain Stevens said during a lull in radio communications, "Are you feeling any unusual vibrations through the controls?" "Something feels slightly off." Mitchell glanced at his instrument panel, which showed all systems operating within normal parameters. The hydraulic pressure readings were steady, the flight controls were responsive, and the aircraft was maintaining course and altitude exactly as programmed. "I'm not feeling anything unusual," Mitchell replied. "These aircraft are incredibly smooth compared to older models. What you're noticing is probably just the difference in air density as we climb through altitude layers." Stevens wasn't entirely convinced, but Mitchell's experience commanded respect. If the captain wasn't concerned about minor vibrations, she wouldn't press the issue. She'd learned that questioning senior pilots too aggressively was a quick way to damage her career prospects. What neither pilot realized was that the autopilot system was already making micro-corrections to compensate for subtle changes in control authority. The hydraulic pressure variance that Marcus had been tracking was affecting the responsiveness of the left stabilizer, and the flight management computer was automatically adjusting other control surfaces to maintain stable flight. These compensations were so small and gradual that they were imperceptible to the crew, but they were masking a growing crisis that would soon exceed the autopilot's ability to manage. Meanwhile, in the passenger cabin, Robert Hayes was monitoring social media responses to his coverage of Marcus's removal. The story had exploded across multiple platforms with #Atlantic Airways discrimination trending on Twitter, viral videos on TikTok, reaching millions of views, and news outlets beginning to pick up the story for their evening broadcasts. Update. Still, no response from Atlantic Air about discrimination incident Robert posted to his 50,000 Instagram followers. Passenger removed for security threat was actually an engineer trying to monitor safety systems. This gets worse the more we learn. The comments were overwhelmingly supportive of Marcus and critical of the airline. "I hope this engineer sues them for everything they're worth. How does the airline not recognize the person who designed their planes?" This is exactly why we need federal legislation protecting passengers from airline bias. I'm boycotting Atlantic Airways until they fire everyone involved in this discrimination. But buried among hundreds of supportive comments was one that made Robert's blood run cold. Wait, he was monitoring safety systems. What if he was trying to warn them about something important? What if the plane is actually in danger? Robert stared at that comment, remembering Marcus's desperate attempts to explain something about hydraulic systems and safety concerns. At the time, Robert had focused on the obvious discrimination and injustice. But what if Marcus had been trying to warn them about genuine mechanical problems? Robert looked around the cabin, noticing for the first time that the ride seemed slightly less smooth than usual. The aircraft was experiencing minor vibrations and small course corrections that felt different from normal turbulence. He pulled out his phone and began typing a new post. Getting concerned about this flight. The engineer they removed was specifically trying to monitor safety systems. Flight feels rougher than normal. Is it possible he was trying to warn us about mechanical problems? As Flight 447 continued eastward over the Atlantic Ocean, the story of Marcus Williams's removal was becoming one of the biggest airline discrimination scandals in social media history. Videos of his confrontation with Captain Mitchell had been viewed over 10 million times across platforms, with news outlets, civil rights organizations, and aviation experts all weighing in on the incident. But what started as a clear-cut case of airline discrimination was becoming more complicated as people began examining Marcus's claims about safety concerns and technical expertise. Aviation experts who reviewed the viral videos were startled to hear Marcus discussing specific hydraulic system details that only someone with intimate knowledge of Boeing 787 design would understand. Dr. Sarah Chen, an aerospace engineering professor at MIT, posted a detailed Twitter thread analyzing Marcus's technical statements. "I've reviewed the viral videos from Atlantic Airways Flight 447. The passenger's comments about left stabilizer hydraulic pressure variance and control authority loss are highly specific and technically accurate. Only someone with advanced knowledge of 787 systems would know these details. This wasn't random technobabble. This was expert-level engineering analysis." Her thread was shared thousands of times, adding a new dimension to public discussion about the incident. What if Marcus wasn't just a victim of discrimination? What if he was also a safety expert whose warnings had been ignored? Aviation industry publications began investigating Marcus's credentials and discovered that he was indeed exactly who he claimed to be, a lead systems engineer at Aerotech Dynamics, with direct responsibility for Atlantic Airways 787 flight control systems. Exclusive passenger removed from Atlantic Airways flight designed the aircraft's safety systems, reported Aviation Week in a breaking news alert that sent shockwaves through the industry. Meanwhile, Aerotech Dynamics was facing its own public relations crisis. Social media pressure was mounting for the company to explain why they hadn't backed up their employee during the airport confrontation, and why their security protocols had prevented Marcus from monitoring systems he'd personally designed. But the most alarming development came from other engineers and pilots who began examining the technical implications of Marcus's warnings. If Flight 447 was truly experiencing the hydraulic system failures he'd described the aircraft, and everyone aboard might be in mortal danger. Flight tracking websites showed thousands of people following Flight 447's progress across the Atlantic, watching for any signs of emergency procedures or course deviations that might indicate mechanical problems. The story was no longer just about discrimination. It was becoming a real-time drama about whether a plane full of people was flying toward disaster, and whether the only person qualified to help them had been removed from the aircraft because of prejudice and assumptions. Marcus, still detained at JFK but now monitoring the crisis remotely, watched the hydraulic pressure variance continue climbing toward critical thresholds. He'd tried everything within his power to warn the authorities, but official channels moved slowly, while physics moved with relentless inevitability. The data was now showing 2.7% variance approaching the threshold where backup systems would begin engaging automatically. When that happened, Captain Mitchell would finally have concrete evidence that something was seriously wrong with his aircraft. Unfortunately, by then it would be too late for preventive measures. They'd be flying over the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, hundreds of miles from emergency landing sites, with hydraulic systems failing faster than anyone could compensate. Marcus prayed that his engineering calculations were wrong, but deep in his heart he knew they weren't. Flight 447 was flying toward catastrophe, and he was powerless to stop it. At exactly 8:23 p.m. Eastern Time, with Flight 447 cruising at 35,000 feet over the North Atlantic, Marcus Williams' worst fears became reality. The left stabilizer's primary hydraulic line, weakened by metal fatigue that his monitoring systems had detected hours earlier, burst under the pressure differential created by high-altitude flight. The failure was instantaneous and catastrophic. One moment, Captain Mitchell was reviewing weather reports for their London arrival. The next moment, his aircraft was rolling violently to the left as the stabilizer lost hydraulic pressure and control authority. "Mayday! Mayday! Mayday!" First Officer Stevens shouted into her radio as alarms blared throughout the cockpit. "Atlantic, 447 experiencing flight control emergency. We're losing control authority and entering an uncontrolled roll. In the passenger cabin, the effect was terrifying. The aircraft suddenly banked 30 degrees to the left, then 45 degrees, throwing passengers against their seatbelts and sending loose items flying across the aisles. Overhead, compartments burst open, spilling luggage onto screaming passengers below. Patricia Blackwell, who had spent the flight congratulating herself for identifying a security threat, found herself pressed against her window as the aircraft rolled past 60 degrees. Her designer handbag flew across the cabin, striking another passenger in the head. Her confident worldview was literally turning upside down. "What's happening?" she screamed, but her voice was lost in the chorus of terror filling the cabin. Robert Hayes, strapped into seat 3B with his phone still in his hand, was trying to process the impossible speed with which their routine flight had become a nightmare. One moment, he'd been posting updates about airline discrimination. Now, he was live-streaming what might be his final minutes of life. "Oh God," he spoke into his phone as the aircraft continued its violent roll. "The plane is out of control. The engineer they removed was right. He was trying to warn us." Captain Mitchell fought desperately with the controls, but the aircraft was no longer responding to conventional inputs. The autopilot had disengaged automatically when the hydraulic failure exceeded its compensation parameters, leaving him to manually control an aircraft that was rolling toward an inverted position at 550 miles per hour. "Jennifer," he shouted to his first officer, "I need emergency procedures for hydraulic failure. The left stabilizer isn't responding." Stevens was already pulling up emergency checklists, but the procedures for total hydraulic failure were designed for controlled descent scenarios, not uncontrolled rolling at cruise altitude. The aircraft was now past 90 degrees of roll, and gravity was combining with aerodynamic forces to accelerate their descent toward the ocean. Captain emergency procedures call for reducing power and attempting to level the aircraft using asymmetric thrust. Stevens replied, her voice steady, despite the G-forces pressing her into her seat. But Mitchell's 25 years of flying experience hadn't prepared him for this scenario. He'd trained for engine failures, severe weather, and system malfunctions, but never for the complete loss of hydraulic control authority that Marcus had tried to warn him about. As the aircraft rolled through 120 degrees and entered an unrecoverable dive, Mitchell felt the crushing weight of realization. The young man in the hoodie, the passenger he'd dismissed as a security threat, had been trying to prevent exactly this catastrophe. In Atlantic Airways Operations Center at JFK, the emergency began with a routine radio transmission that quickly escalated into the company's worst nightmare. Flight 447's Mayday call triggered automatic emergency protocols, but the initial response was hampered by the unprecedented nature of the crisis. "Atlantic Operations, this is 447 Heavy," came Captain Mitchell's voice over the emergency frequency, strained with effort and barely audible over cockpit alarms. "We've lost primary hydraulic control of the left stabilizer. Aircraft is in uncontrolled descent. Requesting immediate assistance." Janet Morrison, who had been dealing with Marcus Williams's detention just hours earlier, felt her stomach drop as she realized the connection between his warnings and the current emergency. She grabbed her radio with trembling hands. 447 Heavy Atlantic Operations. We have engineering support standing by. Can you maintain altitude-negative operations? We're descending through 32,000 feet in an uncontrolled roll. I can't level the aircraft. Morrison looked around the operations center, seeing the growing panic in her colleagues' eyes. This was exactly the scenario Marcus had predicted, and he was currently sitting in a security office being interrogated as a potential terrorist. "Get Dr. Williams up here immediately," she shouted to security personnel, "and get me a direct line to the cockpit." Marcus was brought to the operations center under escort, still technically in custody, but now desperately needed by the same people who had dismissed his warnings. When he saw the radar display showing Flight 447's erratic descent profile, his worst fears were confirmed. "They're at 30,000 feet and descending at 30,000 feet per minute," Morrison said urgently. "Can you help them?" Marcus looked at the data streaming from Flight 447's emergency transponder, seeing hydraulic pressure readings that confirmed total system failure in the left stabilizer. But his years of engineering experience also showed him possibilities that the flight crew couldn't see. "Get me radio contact with Captain Mitchell," Marcus said, sitting down at the communications console. "I can walk him through manual control procedures using asymmetric engine thrust and rudder authority." Morrison established the connection, and suddenly Marcus's voice was filling the cockpit of Flight 447. "Captain Mitchell, this is Dr. Marcus Williams speaking from Atlantic Operations. I know you can hear me, and I know you're dealing with exactly the hydraulic failure I tried to warn you about. But this aircraft can still be controlled manually if you follow my instructions exactly." In the cockpit of Flight 447, Captain Mitchell's pride warred with his desperation as Marcus's voice came through the radio. The man he'd ridiculed and removed from the aircraft was now offering to save everyone's life. Dr. Williams Mitchell said, his voice cracking with emotion, "I need your help. Tell me what to do. Captain, you need to reduce power on both engines to 60% immediately. The aircraft is gaining speed in the dive, which is making the roll worse. Reduce power now." Mitchell followed the instructions, pulling back the throttles as the aircraft continued its terrifying descent through 28,000 feet. The reduction in power slowed their descent rate slightly, but they were still rolling uncontrollably. "Good, Captain. Now I need you to use asymmetric thrust to counter the roll. Increase power on the right engine to 75% while keeping the left engine at 60%. This will create a turning moment that should help level the aircraft." The technique was advanced flight dynamics that wasn't taught in standard pilot training, but Marcus's engineering background gave him knowledge of aerodynamic principles that could save the aircraft. As Mitchell adjusted engine power settings, the violent rolling motion began to slow. "It's working," Stevens shouted. "The roll rate is decreasing." "Excellent," Marcus replied, monitoring telemetry data from 1000 miles away. "Now, I need you to use rudder input to help coordinate the turn. Apply full right rudder and hold it steady while maintaining the asymmetric thrust setting." For the next 20 minutes, Marcus guided Captain Mitchell through a series of emergency procedures that no pilot had ever attempted before. Using engine thrust differentials, rudder inputs, and careful manipulation of the aircraft's remaining control surfaces, they gradually regained control of the aircraft. "Atlantic, 447. You're now level at 15,000 feet with stable flight characteristics," came the voice of air traffic control. "We have emergency landing clearance at Boston Logan. Runway 4 left is clear and emergency equipment is standing by." The landing approach was unlike anything Mitchell had ever attempted. Without normal hydraulic control authority, every adjustment required precise coordination between engine thrust and rudder inputs, guided by Marcus's real-time calculations and engineering expertise. "Captain, you're going to land this aircraft using engine thrust for pitch control and rudder for heading control," Marcus explained. "It's going to feel completely different from normal landings, but the aircraft is controllable if you trust the physics." As Flight 447 approached Boston Logan's runway 4 left, emergency vehicles lined the taxiways with lights flashing and foam equipment ready. But thanks to Marcus's guidance, the landing was surprisingly smooth. The aircraft touched down firmly but safely, rolling out normally before taxiing clear of the runway. When the engines finally spooled down and the cabin lights came on, 280 passengers and crew members were alive because the man they'd rejected had spent every moment since his removal working to save them. In the sudden silence that followed engine shutdown, Captain Mitchell's voice came over the cabin public address system. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. Our safe arrival tonight is due to the expertise and dedication of Dr. Marcus Williams, the passenger we removed before departure. Dr. Williams guided us through an emergency that should have been impossible to survive. We owe him our lives." Throughout the cabin, passengers who had watched Marcus's removal with varying degrees of sympathy or approval now understood the full magnitude of what had transpired. They'd witnessed discrimination that nearly cost them their lives, saved only by the grace and competence of the man they'd allowed to be humiliated. Patricia Blackwell, her designer clothes rumpled and her carefully styled hair disheveled, sat in stunned silence. She'd been wrong about everything. Her assumptions, her prejudices, her confident judgments all had been revealed as dangerous delusions that had nearly killed everyone aboard. Robert Hayes, still clutching his phone, looked directly into his camera one final time. Dr. Marcus Williams just saved 280 lives from 1000 miles away. He guided us through an impossible emergency after being removed from the flight for trying to prevent it. This man is a hero, and everyone who dismissed him should be ashamed. The aircraft sat safely on the Boston Logan ramp. Engines, quiet passengers alive, and a story of prejudice and redemption that would change Atlantic Airways forever. The Atlantic Airways VIP lounge at Boston Logan had been hastily converted into a crisis management center with executives, investigators, and media representatives crowding into a space designed for quiet luxury. Outside news vans lined the airport perimeter as word spread about the dramatic emergency landing and the discrimination scandal that had preceded it. Jonathan Harrison, CEO of Atlantic Airways, had flown from New York on the company jet, arriving at Boston Logan 30 minutes after Flight 447's emergency landing. His normally composed demeanor was cracked with stress as he faced the worst crisis in the airline's history, a mechanical emergency that had nearly killed 280 people caused by discrimination that had removed the only person qualified to prevent it. When Marcus Williams finally arrived at the lounge, still technically in custody but now accompanied by federal aviation investigators rather than airport security, the room fell silent. The man who had been dismissed as a security threat was now recognized as the hero who had saved everyone aboard Flight 447. Marcus looked tired but resolute as he faced the room full of passengers who had witnessed his removal. He carried the same worn leather backpack and wore the same gray hoodie that had marked him as suspicious to Captain Mitchell and Sofia Rodriguez. But now, those casual clothes seemed to emphasize the gulf between appearance and expertise that had nearly proven fatal. Dr. Williams Harrison said, stepping forward with genuine humility, "I want to personally apologize for the treatment you received from our employees. Your warnings were accurate, your concerns were valid, and our failure to listen nearly resulted in tragedy." Marcus nodded acknowledgement but didn't speak immediately. His eyes swept the lounge, taking in the faces of passengers who had watched his humiliation with varying degrees of sympathy, amusement, or approval. Most now looked ashamed. Some were crying. A few, including Patricia Blackwell, couldn't meet his gaze. Mr. Harrison Marcus said finally, his voice calm but carrying weight that made everyone lean forward to listen, "I appreciate your apology. But this wasn't just about me. This was about a culture that values assumptions over evidence, appearance over expertise, and prejudice over safety." Robert Hayes, who had been documenting the entire crisis on social media, held up his phone to capture Marcus's words. The livestream had over 100,000 viewers, watching in real time as the story reached its climax. Dr. Williams, Robert said, his voice carrying clearly through the lounge, "You saved all our lives tonight. What do you want people to learn from what happened here?" Marcus looked directly at the camera, knowing his words would reach far beyond the passengers who had witnessed his treatment. "I want people to understand that competence has no color," Marcus said. "Expertise doesn't require expensive clothes. And the person you dismiss based on appearance might be the same person whose knowledge saves your life." Harrison had arrived at Boston Logan with termination papers already prepared. The social media explosion surrounding Marcus's removal had made clear that heads would roll, but the near-fatal consequences of the discrimination had elevated personnel decisions from public relations management to criminal liability. Captain Derek Mitchell Harrison announced to the assembled group, "Your pilot's license is suspended pending FAA investigation. Your 25-year career with Atlantic Airways is terminated effective immediately. Your decisions today endangered 280 lives and nearly destroyed this company." Mitchell, who had been sitting alone in the corner of the lounge, looked up with haunted eyes. The man who had confidently dismissed Marcus's warnings 8 hours earlier was now a broken shell destroyed by the realization that his prejudice had nearly caused mass death. Dr. Williams Mitchell said, his voice barely audible, "I'm sorry. I was wrong about everything. Thank you for saving my life despite how I treated you." Marcus looked at the broken pilot for a long moment before responding. "Captain, I didn't save your life despite how you treated me. I saved it because those 279 other passengers didn't deserve to die for your mistakes." The words hit Mitchell like physical blows, but they were delivered without malice, simply statements of fact that cut deeper than any anger could have. Sophia Rodriguez Harrison continued, "You are terminated effective immediately for discriminatory conduct and failure to follow proper passenger service protocols. Your actions contributed directly to today's crisis." Sophia sat with tears streaming down her face, her 5-year career destroyed by her assumptions about who belonged in first class. She looked at Marcus, wanting to apologize, but unable to find words adequate to the magnitude of her errors. Tyler Brooks Harrison said, consulting his list of terminations, "You are terminated for discriminatory treatment of passengers during the boarding process. Your comments about passenger appearance and your failure to treat Dr. Williams with appropriate respect contributed to this crisis." Tyler wasn't even in the room. He'd been fired by phone, while Flight 447 was still in emergency descent. His career in the airline industry was over before it had really begun, destroyed by prejudices he didn't even realize he harbored. "Ladies and gentlemen," Harrison addressed the entire lounge, "Atlantic Airways takes full responsibility for today's events. We failed our passengers, we failed our safety obligations, and we nearly failed the families who trusted us to bring their loved ones home safely." Throughout the lounge, passengers were grappling with the reality of what they had witnessed and in some cases participated in. The discrimination they had seen during boarding had evolved from entertainment to embarrassment to horror as they understood its nearly fatal consequences. Patricia Blackwell finally stood up, her designer clothes wrinkled and her composure completely shattered. She walked slowly toward Marcus, her steps hesitant and her eyes filled with tears. "Dr. Williams," she said, her voice breaking, "I owe you the most profound apology. My behavior today was inexcusable. My assumptions were wrong, my comments were horrible, and you saved my life despite having every reason to let me suffer the consequences of my prejudice." Marcus looked at her steadily, seeing genuine remorse in her expression. "Mrs. Blackwell, I appreciate your apology, but what matters more than what you say now is what you do going forward. This experience should change how you see people who don't fit your expectations." Patricia nodded, tears flowing freely. "It has. It will. I promise you it will." Robert Hayes stepped forward, extending his hand to Marcus. "Dr. Williams, I've been posting about this situation all day, but I want to say in person you're a hero. Not just for your technical expertise, but for your grace under pressure, and your willingness to save people who had treated you badly." Marcus shook Robert's hand. "Thank you for documenting what happened today. Sometimes, the only way to change unjust practices is to make sure people can see how they really work." Other passengers approached Marcus with their own apologies, expressions of gratitude and commitments to do better. A businessman confessed that he'd agreed with Patricia's comments during boarding. A young couple admitted they'd been entertained by the confrontation without considering its implications. An elderly woman thanked Marcus for forgiving people who didn't deserve his grace. But perhaps the most powerful moment came when a teenage girl approached Marcus with her parents. "Dr. Williams," she said, "I'm studying aerospace engineering and I want to be like you someday. Thank you for showing that being smart matters more than fitting in." Marcus smiled, the first genuine smile he'd displayed since boarding Flight 447 12 hours earlier. "Keep studying," he told her. "The world needs engineers who care more about being right than being comfortable." The room erupted in sustained applause that echoed through the lounge and out into the terminal where other travelers stopped to see what was happening. It wasn't just recognition of Marcus's heroism, it was acknowledgement of a moment when prejudice had been exposed, challenged, and ultimately overcome. As the applause died down, Marcus picked up his worn leather backpack and looked around the room one final time. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, "I hope you all have safe travels home. And I hope the next time you see someone who doesn't look like they belong, you'll remember that appearances can be deceiving, but physics never lies." The simple dignity of his words provided the perfect conclusion to a day that had begun with discrimination and ended with redemption. As Marcus walked out of the lounge, passengers continued applauding until he disappeared from view, carrying with him the respect he'd always deserved, but finally earned through circumstances no one should have endured. The crisis was over, but the changes it would bring were just beginning. 6 months after Flight 447's emergency landing, Atlantic Airways had transformed itself from top to bottom. The comprehensive changes began with what employees immediately nicknamed the Williams Protocol, a set of policies, procedures, and cultural reforms designed to ensure that competence would never again be dismissed because of appearance or assumptions. Jonathan Harrison stood before the airline's board of directors in the Manhattan headquarters conference room, presenting quarterly results that showed remarkable improvements across every metric that mattered. Customer satisfaction scores had reached all-time highs. Employee diversity had increased dramatically. Most importantly, safety reporting and incident prevention had improved beyond anything the airline had previously achieved. The Williams Protocol has exceeded our most optimistic projections, Harrison told the board. Mandatory bias training for all employees has been completed company-wide. Zero-tolerance policies for discriminatory behavior have been implemented at every level. And our new technical consultation requirements ensure that engineering expertise is respected, regardless of how it's packaged. The changes had been swift and comprehensive. Every Atlantic Airways employee, from gate agents to senior pilots, now completed quarterly training on unconscious bias, cultural competence, and respectful passenger service. The training wasn't just theoretical, it included specific scenarios based on the Flight 447 incident, ensuring that every employee understood exactly how prejudice could escalate into safety crises. New hiring practices prioritized competence and character over appearance and assumptions. Promotion criteria were revised to emphasize inclusive leadership and evidence-based decision-making. Performance evaluations now included specific measures of respectful treatment for all passengers, regardless of their appearance or perceived status. Perhaps most significantly, Atlantic Airways had established the Technical Expert Program, which granted special status to engineers and technical specialists who needed to monitor or inspect aircraft operations. These experts could now board aircraft in any appropriate attire, carry necessary diagnostic equipment, and communicate directly with flight crews about safety concerns. The program's first participant was Dr. Marcus Williams, who now served as Atlantic Airways' chief safety consultant while maintaining his position at Aerotech Dynamics. His recommendations for aircraft monitoring and maintenance procedures had already prevented 2 other potential hydraulic failures across the airline's fleet. The Williams Protocol isn't just about preventing discrimination. Harrison explained to industry colleagues who were implementing similar programs. It's about creating a culture where safety information can flow freely, where expertise is recognized regardless of its source, and where everyone feels empowered to speak up about potential problems. Marcus Williams had never sought fame or recognition, but the story of Flight 447 had made him one of the most recognizable figures in commercial aviation. His calm professionalism during the crisis, combined with his gracious response to the discrimination he'd experienced, had made him a symbol of competence triumphing over prejudice. But Marcus used his newfound platform carefully focusing on education rather than publicity. He accepted speaking engagements at engineering conferences, university campuses, and industry workshops, always emphasizing technical excellence and inclusive leadership rather than dwelling on the injustices he'd experienced. "I don't want to be known as the engineer who was discriminated against," Marcus told audiences. "I want to be known as the engineer who helped prove that good decisions come from good data, regardless of who provides it." His promotion to Chief Safety Officer at Aerotech Dynamics had come with expanded responsibilities for training programs and safety protocols across the aerospace industry. Marcus worked directly with airlines, aircraft manufacturers, and regulatory agencies to develop better ways for identifying and addressing potential safety issues before they became emergencies. The technical innovations that emerged from the Flight 447 incident were changing how airlines monitored aircraft health. Marcus's real-time diagnostic protocols were now standard equipment on new aircraft, providing continuous monitoring of critical operations and early warning of potential failures. But perhaps Marcus's greatest legacy was the generation of young engineers and pilots who saw him as proof that technical competence could overcome any barrier. Engineering schools reported increases in minority enrollment, with many students citing Marcus's example as inspiration for their career choices. At MIT, where Marcus had earned his graduate degree, the Williams Fellowship was established to support graduate students from underrepresented backgrounds pursuing aerospace engineering. The fellowship emphasized not just technical training, but leadership development and advocacy skills needed to ensure diverse voices were heard in critical industries. Dr. Williams showed us that engineering isn't just about solving technical problems, said Dr. Sarah Chen, who directed the fellowship program. It's about solving human problems, too. Sometimes the biggest barrier to safety isn't a mechanical failure. It's a failure of imagination about who can provide solutions. Marcus continued flying Atlantic Airways regularly, often wearing the same gray hoodie that had marked him as suspicious on Flight 447. But now, flight crews recognized him immediately, greeting him with respect and gratitude rather than suspicion. His presence on flights served as a constant reminder that competence came in all packages. More importantly, other passengers learned from his example. Social media was filled with stories of travelers defending fellow passengers against discrimination, citing the Flight 447 incident as proof that everyone deserved respect and dignity regardless of their appearance. 1 year after Flight 447's emergency landing, Marcus Williams found himself back at JFK Terminal 4, preparing to board the same route to London Heathrow. Atlantic Airways had invited him to participate in a memorial ceremony honoring the anniversary of the incident and celebrating the changes that had emerged from the crisis. As Marcus approached Gate 23, he was struck by how different the atmosphere felt from that stormy evening 12 months earlier. The boarding process was respectful and efficient. Gate agents treated every passenger with courtesy regardless of their appearance. The priority boarding line welcomed travelers based on their tickets rather than their clothing. When Marcus reached the boarding podium, the gate agent, a young woman named Lisa Torres, who had been hired under the airline's new inclusive recruiting program, smiled warmly as she scanned his boarding pass. "Dr. Williams," she said, "it's an honor to have you flying with us today. Thank you for everything you've done to make aviation safer for everyone." Marcus boarded Flight 447, the same aircraft that had nearly crashed a year earlier, now equipped with enhanced monitoring systems he had helped design. As he found his seat in 2A, he was greeted by Captain Jennifer Stevens, who had been promoted to captain after completing additional training in crisis management and inclusive leadership. Dr. William Stevens said, "I want you to know that every pilot at Atlantic Airways has studied your technical guidance from that night. You didn't just save one flight, you've changed how we think about emergency procedures and crew resource management." The flight to London was routine in the best possible way. Smooth takeoff, stable cruise, comfortable landing. But for Marcus, it represented something far more significant than a successful trip. It represented proof that change was possible, that organizations could learn from their failures, and that technical excellence and human dignity could coexist. As the aircraft touched down at London Heathrow, Marcus reflected on the journey that had brought him from discrimination to recognition, from being dismissed to being celebrated, from being removed from an aircraft to helping save everyone aboard it. He thought about the passengers who had applauded Patricia Blackwell's prejudice and later applauded his heroism. He thought about Captain Mitchell, who had lost his career but gained humility. He thought about the hundreds of engineers and pilots who now understood that bias could be as dangerous as mechanical failure. Most of all, he thought about the young people who saw in his story proof that competence mattered more than conformity, that expertise was more powerful than prejudice, and that quiet dignity could change the world one decision at a time. When Marcus disembarked at Heathrow, he was met by representatives from Rolls-Royce, the company that manufactured the engines he had helped design monitoring operations for. They were implementing his safety protocols across their entire product line, ensuring that future flights would benefit from lessons learned through discrimination and redeemed through expertise. As Marcus walked through the terminal past travelers who might or might not recognize him, he carried with him the knowledge that his experience had made aviation safer for everyone. The man who had been judged by his hoodie had helped create a world where competence was judged by performance rather than appearance. Flight 447 had been more than an emergency landing. It had been a transformation of an airline of an industry, and of the understanding that safety and dignity were inseparable values that protected everyone who trusted their lives to the expertise of others. The story of Marcus Williams proved that sometimes the person you least expect to save your life is exactly the person you need most. And sometimes the greatest changes begin with someone having the courage to stand up and say, "If I leave this plane, people are going to die." That's not a threat, that's physics. In the end, physics and justice had prevailed. Thank you for watching this incredible story of courage, prejudice, and redemption. If Dr. Marcus Williams's story moved you, if it made you think differently about assumptions and appearances, then please hit that like button right now. Share this video with everyone you know, your family, your friends, your coworkers. Post it on your social media. Send it to someone who needs to hear this message about dignity and respect. And if you haven't already, smash that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. We share stories like this every single day. Stories about justice, courage, and people who change the world through quiet strength and unwavering principles. Drop a comment below and tell us. Have you ever been judged unfairly because of how you looked? Have you ever witnessed discrimination and wished you'd spoken up? What would you have done if you were on Flight 447? Your story matters. Your voice matters. And together, we can build a world where competence is valued over appearances, where expertise is respected, regardless of packaging, and where everyone gets the dignity they deserve. Until next time, remember, never judge a book by its cover. The person sitting next to you in casual clothes might just be the genius who saves your life.